Night terror on the highway. The night had settled over the long, desolate stretch of highway, casting eerie shadows under the full moon. Jenna gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension. The glowing green numbers on her car's dashboard read 11:43 p.m. It had been hours since she left the small, quiet town of Stonebridge, where she had visited her sister. Now she was headed back to the city, eager to return home. But something was off. A car had been following her for the past 30 minutes, its headlights piercing the darkness in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it was just another late-night driver on the same route, but now it was clear. The driver wasn't passing her, wasn't falling behind. The car simply lingered, hovering a few car lengths away. A pit of unease formed in her stomach. She glanced again in the rearview mirror. The car behind her, a dark sedan, was keeping pace perfectly with her, mirroring every move. Every time she sped up, so did the car. When she slowed down, it would too. Her pulse quickened, heart thumping loudly in her chest. She'd heard stories about nighttime highway stalkers, urban legends mostly, but those stories always felt distant, never something she would encounter in real life. Yet here she was, alone, with nothing but the empty road ahead and the shadowy vehicle behind. Jenna tapped her phone, checking for a signal. Nothing. Just her luck. The reception had been spotty for miles, and she couldn't afford to stop anywhere to try and make a call. The nearest gas station or rest stop was at least 15 minutes away, if she remembered correctly. And even then, would it be open? She tried to think rationally. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Perhaps the driver behind her didn't even realize they were making her nervous. But when the sedan switched lanes to follow her as she veered right around a bend, her breath caught in her throat. Suddenly, a sign loomed ahead on the side of the road. Rest stop, 5 miles. Relief washed over her. If she could make it there, she could pull in, pretend to take a break, and see if the car would continue past her. Maybe it wasn't a stalker after all. Jenna pressed her foot down on the gas, speeding up slightly. The car behind her did the same, maintaining the exact distance. She was now certain this was no coincidence. Whoever was driving the sedan was tracking her. As she approached the rest stop, her eyes darted between the road and the mirror. The small parking lot came into view, dimly lit, with a single vending machine casting a pale glow. There were no other cars. Jenna's chest tightened. Should she stop or keep driving? Her instinct screamed to keep going, but her logical mind knew she needed a break from this terrifying cat-and-mouse game. She made a split-second decision. She swerved into the rest stop and parked as close to the light as she could, keeping the engine running. The dark sedan pulled in too, parking several spaces away. Jenna could feel the driver's eyes on her, though the tinted windows concealed any sign of the person inside. Her fingers trembled as she pretended to look through her glove compartment, trying to appear calm. A part of her hoped that the other driver was simply stopping for a rest too, that this wasn't what it felt like. But every fiber of her being screamed danger. The door to the sedan creaked open. Jenna's heart froze. She watched as a man stepped out, a tall figure dressed in dark clothes. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. Panic surged through her veins. She slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as she backed out of the parking spot. The man didn't run after her, but she saw him smile in the glow of her headlights, a sick, twisted grin that chilled her to the bone. Jenna floored the gas pedal, speeding back onto the highway. Her heart pounded in her ears, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. The sedan followed, slipping back onto the road behind her, even closer than before. Terror clawed at her throat. She needed help. She needed to get off this highway. The minutes ticked by like hours as Jenna kept driving, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The sedan was toying with her now, occasionally speeding up as if to overtake her, then falling back again. It was a game, a terrifying, adrenaline-filled game that Jenna was losing. She was now miles away from the rest stop, with no sign of any other cars. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, a dark ribbon cutting through the endless night. But then, in the distance, she saw it, a pair of headlights heading her way. A wave of hope surged through her. Another driver. As the vehicle approached, Jenna honked her horn frantically, flashing her lights. The oncoming car slowed slightly, probably confused by her erratic behavior. She waved her arms out of the window, trying to signal for help. But as the car passed her, it did nothing. No one stopped. Despair sank in. She was alone again, with her stalker still relentlessly trailing behind her. Then the unthinkable happened. The sedan sped up, its headlights growing brighter and brighter in her mirror. Within seconds, the car was right on her tail, bumping her bumper gently at first, then more forcefully. Jenna screamed, gripping the wheel, trying to maintain control. Her car swerved slightly, but she managed to keep it on the road. The sedan rammed into her again, harder this time, sending her car fishtailing across the highway. She fought to regain control, her tires screeching against the asphalt. She couldn't let the car spin out. Not here. Not while he was so close. Suddenly, she saw an exit ramp up ahead. Without thinking, she swerved onto it, her car jerking violently as she made the sharp turn. The sedan followed, still glued to her bumper. The exit led her down a narrow, winding road, flanked by dense trees on either side. Jenna's hands were slick with sweat, her vision blurring from tears and panic. There had to be a town nearby, a house, anything. As if answering her prayers, a set of faint lights appeared through the trees, a small gas station. Jenna hit the gas, speeding toward it, her hope flickering like the dim bulbs illuminating the station. The sedan stayed close, but Jenna wasn't going to let him get her. Not now. She swerved into the gas station, parking haphazardly near the entrance. Without waiting, she jumped out of the car, sprinting toward the doors. The gas station was empty, save for an older man behind the counter, who looked up with wide eyes as Jenna burst in. "Help me!" she cried, her voice trembling. "Someone's chasing me!" The old man frowned, looking past her at the empty parking lot. "Chasing you? Where?" Jenna turned, expecting to see the sedan parked outside, but it wasn't there. The lot was empty, save for her own car, still running with the headlights on. "No," she whispered, backing up against the counter. "He was right there." The old man gave her a sympathetic look, as if he'd seen this kind of thing before. "You sure you're not just tired, miss? It's late. These roads can play tricks on you." Jenna's heart pounded. Was he right? Had she imagined the whole thing? The fear, the chase, the car, it had all felt so real. She turned to look outside again, her hands trembling. There was nothing. No sign of the sedan, no man, no headlights in the distance. But just as her mind began to settle, something moved in the shadows near the edge of the trees. A figure, watching. Jenna's stomach dropped. It wasn't over. Title: Night at the Pizza Stop. On a desolate stretch of highway between long miles of silent fields and winding blacktop sat a small, weather-beaten pizza joint called Mario's Slice. It was one of those places that truckers and travelers might stumble upon late at night, half-starved and desperate for a warm meal. The glowing red "open" sign flickered like a warning in the thickening fog, and the dim lights inside cast long shadows across the cracked parking lot. Jenny was already regretting her decision to stop here. She had been on the road for hours, driving through rural backroads, trying to avoid the heavy traffic on the main highway. Her stomach growled insistently, reminding her of the last time she had eaten, and when she saw the pizza joint appear in the distance, it felt like a brief oasis in the dark wilderness. Pulling into the lot, Jenny noticed there were no other cars. The place looked eerily deserted, yet the sign promised food, and the door hung open slightly, a sliver of dim light spilling out into the night. She parked, pulling her jacket tight against the sudden chill that hung in the air. The fog swirled thickly around her as she crossed the lot, feeling a strange unease creep up her spine. Inside, the atmosphere was no better. The place was small, with only a few tables scattered around the worn floor, and the counter stood in the far corner under a dim yellow light. A radio hummed softly in the background, playing an old country song, but there was no one behind the counter. "Hello?" Jenny called out, her voice bouncing off the walls of the nearly empty space. After a few moments of silence, a tall, gaunt man emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a stained apron. His eyes were hollow, dark rings circling them, and he had an odd, slow smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evenin'," he drawled. "Looking for a bite to eat?" Yeah," Jenny said, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling creeping through her. "Just a small pizza, I guess." The man nodded, moving with unsettling slowness as he turned back into the kitchen. Jenny sat down at a table by the window, glancing out at the highway. The fog was thickening, swallowing the edges of the road, and the distant sounds of crickets and the occasional hum of an engine passing through seemed muffled by the dense night air. As she waited, Jenny's phone buzzed. A text from her friend Emily popped up. "How's the road trip going? You staying safe?" Jenny tapped a quick reply, assuring her friend that everything was fine, though her stomach twisted slightly as she sent the message. Something about this place felt wrong. She couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't alone, even though the restaurant seemed deserted. The door creaked open suddenly, and Jenny's head snapped up. A man had entered, his silhouette dark against the fog outside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a faded leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. His face was mostly hidden under the brim of a baseball cap, but his eyes gleamed with something predatory as he stepped inside. He didn't say a word. Instead, he moved toward a table in the far corner, sitting down with his back to her, Barf facing the kitchen. Jenny's heart thudded a little harder. Something about the man's presence unnerved her. She glanced at the empty parking lot outside. There had been no other car when she arrived. How had he gotten here? Moments later, the kitchen door swung open, and the gaunt man reappeared, carrying Jenny's pizza in his hands. He set it down on the table with a slow, deliberate motion. "Enjoy," he said softly, though his smile was gone, replaced by something colder. His eyes flicked briefly toward the man in the corner before retreating back into the kitchen. Jenny forced a smile, though her appetite had vanished. The strange man in the corner was silent, his face obscured, and the air in the room felt thick with tension. She took a slice of pizza, trying to calm her nerves as she bit into it. The crust was cold, and the cheese tasted sour, but she kept chewing, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the corner of the room, and Jenny jumped. The man in the leather jacket had risen from his chair and was now standing by the table, staring at her intently. His eyes, cold and dark, locked onto hers as he took a step forward. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, though there was no warmth in his tone. It was more of a statement than a question. Jenny's stomach churned. "I'm kind of in a hurry," she stammered, standing up and grabbing her things. The unease had turned into full-blown fear now. She needed to get out of there. The man didn't move. He just stared at her, his mouth curving into a slow, menacing grin. "That's a shame," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Without waiting for a response, Jenny turned on her heel and rushed toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached for the handle, she heard the kitchen door swing open again behind her. The gaunt man stood in the doorway, his eyes locked onto her with that same cold expression. "Leaving already?" he asked. His voice was unnervingly calm. Jenny's hand shook as she yanked the door open and stepped outside into the fog. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop to catch her breath. She bolted toward her car, her pulse racing. The gravel crunched under her feet, and for a moment, she could hear nothing but the sound of her own frantic footsteps. As she reached her car, fumbling with her keys, a sudden scraping sound echoed from behind her. She spun around just in time to see the man in the leather jacket standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching her from the shadows. His figure was hazy in the fog, but she could make out something gleaming in his hand, a long, curved knife that caught the faint light from the street lamp. Panic surged through Jenny. She fumbled with her car door, finally managing to yank it open. She dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she started the engine, her eyes darting toward the parking lot. The man hadn't moved. He stood there, still as a statue, watching her through the fog. His smile was visible even from the distance, a sick, twisted grin that sent a shiver down her spine. Jenny slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. She sped out of the parking lot, her heart racing, glancing in the rearview mirror as the fog swallowed the pizza joint behind her. For a few miles, Jenny drove in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The highway stretched on in front of her, empty and dark, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced in the rearview mirror again, and her blood turned to ice, headlights. Far behind her, a pair of headlights appeared in the fog, growing closer with alarming speed. Jenny's pulse quickened. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be. But as the car approached, its headlights piercing the fog, she could make out the silhouette of the man behind the wheel. He was coming for her. Her foot pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing as the car roared down the highway. But no matter how fast she went, the headlights stayed right behind her, inching closer with every passing second. Suddenly, her car sputtered. The engine coughed and then died, the dashboard lights flickering out. "No, no, no," Jenny screamed, frantically turning the key, but the car remained still, the headlights of the approaching vehicle illuminating the interior of her car. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the man's face, grinning through the window. Room 824. This is an incident of my life I am never going to forget. Even thinking about me gives me the shivers still. I have tried my level best to forget this incident, but it keeps lingering in my memory. It was well past midnight when I finally arrived at the Darkwood Motel. The journey had been long, the roads winding through dark, unfamiliar territory. By the time I reached the motel, I was utterly exhausted, my eyelids heavy, and my body aching from the hours spent behind the wheel. The Darkwood was the only place I could find in this remote area, a grand old building that seemed to have been plucked straight from a different era. Its faded brick facade and dimly lit sign were barely visible in the fog that clung to the night. I stepped inside, really grateful for the warmth of the lobby, which contrasted sharply with the chill outside. The place was quiet, eerily so. The front desk was manned by a single clerk, an elderly man with thinning hair and a weary expression. He looked up as I approached, offering a tired but polite smile. "Welcome to the Darkwood Motel," he said in a low and deep voice. "How may I help you?" "I'd like a room for the night," I replied, my voice sounding just as tired as I felt. The clerk nodded and reached for a large, dusty register on the desk. He flipped through the pages, his fingers moving slowly, almost methodically. After a moment, he looked up at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not many guests this time of year," he remarked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "But we do have a room available, room 824. He handed me an old-fashioned key, the kind with an ornate metal tag attached. The number 824 was engraved on it, worn but still legible. "Your room is on the 7th floor, the clerk said, pointing toward the lift at the far end of the lobby. "Enjoy your stay." I thanked him and made my way to the lift, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. As I rode up to the 7th floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The motel had a strange, musty smell, and the decor was outdated, faded wallpaper, dim lighting, and threadbare carpeting that seemed to belong to a different time. The lift doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a dimly lit hallway that stretched out before me. The walls were lined with old paintings, their colors muted and their frames tarnished with age. The carpet underfoot was thick, but the pattern was faded and worn in places. I glanced at the numbers on the doors as I walked, each one labeled with a brass plate, 710, 711, 712, but there was no sign of room 824. The hallway seemed to go on forever, the lights growing dimmer the further I walked. Just as I was beginning to think I'd made a mistake, I spotted it, a door at the very end of the hallway, almost hidden in the shadows. The brass plate on the door read 824, though the numbers were slightly askew, as if the plate had been hastily attached. I hesitated for a moment, a strange feeling of unease settling over me. But I was too tired to care. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and get some rest. I inserted the key into the lock and turned it, the mechanism clicking softly as the door swung open. The first thing that struck me about room 824 was how old-fashioned it was. The furnishings were all impeccably clean, but they looked like they hadn't been updated in decades. The bed was a massive four-poster with heavy drapes that hung down on all sides. The wallpaper was a deep burgundy with an intricate floral pattern, and the carpet was a rich, dark green. A large wooden wardrobe stood against one wall, and an ornate vanity with a round mirror occupied the opposite corner. The room was illuminated by a single dim lamp on the nightstand, casting long shadows across the floor. There was a television, but it was one of those old boxy models from the 1980s, sitting on a wooden stand near the foot of the bed. The air was cool, almost cold, and there was a faint smell of mothballs and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Despite its age, the room was spotless. The bed was neatly made, the linens crisp and white. The wooden furniture gleamed in the soft light, free of dust or grime. It was as if the room had been preserved in time, untouched by the years that had passed outside its walls. I set my bag down on the bed and let out a deep sigh of relief. My exhaustion had overtaken any feelings of unease I might have had, and all I could think about was getting some sleep. I quickly changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, the mattress firm but surprisingly comfortable. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the room. It was too quiet, too still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. But fatigue won out, and before I knew it, I had drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I was jolted awake by the sound of a phone ringing. The noise was sharp and piercing, echoing through the silence of the room. I sat up, disoriented, and looked around, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was an old rotary phone, sitting on the nightstand next to the bed. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended in with the rest of the room's outdated decor. The phone continued to ring, insistent and demanding. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something compelled me to pick it up. I lifted the receiver to my ear, expecting to hear a voice on the other end. But there was nothing, just silence. I waited for a moment, my heart pounding, but still, no one spoke. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the crackling static. "Please, help me." The voice was distant, distorted, as if it were coming from a great distance. I felt a chill run down my spine as I strained to hear more, but the line went dead. I quickly hung up the phone, my hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the shadows longer and darker. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was just after 3 a.m. The unease I had felt earlier had returned, stronger than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room, that something was watching me from the darkness. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a prank call, a glitch in the phone system. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the image of the voice on the other end, pleading for help. The television flickered on by itself, the screen filled with static. I bolted upright, staring at the old boxy TV in disbelief. The remote was on the nightstand, untouched. I grabbed it and tried to turn off the TV, but the screen remained lit, the static hissing softly. And then through the static, I saw something, a figure, faint and shadowy, standing in the center of the screen. The image flickered and jumped, but the figure remained, unmoving. I couldn't make out any details, but it was clear that the figure was a person, watching me through the screen. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. The figure began to move, slowly at first, and then more quickly, as if approaching the camera. I fumbled with the remote, my hands shaking, and finally managed to turn the TV off. The room was plunged into darkness, the silence deafening. I sat there in the dark, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of glitch, a trick of the light? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong with this room, something deeply, terribly wrong. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep after that. My nerves were shot, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I needed to know more about this room, about what was happening here. I got out of bed and began to search the room, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain the strange occurrences. I checked the wardrobe first, half expecting to find something hidden inside. But it was empty, save for a few wooden hangers that clattered together as I opened the door. The vanity was equally bare, its drawers containing nothing but dust. Finally, I turned my attention to the bed. I lifted the mattress, expecting to find nothing, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw it, a small book bound by leather, wedged between the mattress and the box spring. I pulled it out, my hands kept trembling, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was as neat as the ink slightly faded with age. The first entry was dated nearly 50 years ago. June 4th, 1975. I've checked into room 824 at the Darkwood Motel. The journey was long, and I'm so tired, but there's something about this room that doesn't feel right at all. The air is kinda heavy, and the shadows seem to move by themselves. I can't shake away the feeling of being watched. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the entry. It reflected my own experience so closely that it was uncanny. I flipped through the pages, skimming the entries, and found that they all told a similar story. Guests who had stayed in room 824, all reporting strange occurrences, all feeling a sense of unease that grew stronger with each passing day. As I continued reading, I noticed that the entries grew increasingly frantic, the handwriting becoming more erratic. The guests reported hearing voices, seeing figures in the shadows, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Some entries even mentioned the phone ringing in the middle of the night, just as it had for me. But it was the final entry that sent a wave of cold fear through me. August 15th, 1983. I can't take it anymore. The voices won't stop, and the figure in the TV keeps getting closer. I've tried to leave the room, but the door won't open. It's as if the room is alive, trapping me inside. I don't know how much longer I can last. If anyone finds this diary, please help me. Get out while you still can. The entry ended abruptly, the final words trailing off into a jagged line. I stared at the page, my mind racing. The person who had written this diary, what had happened to them? Had they ever escaped the room, or had they vanished like so many others? A sudden knock at the door startled me, and I dropped the diary, my heart leaping into my throat. I stared at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. Who could it be at this hour? And why did they knock so softly, so deliberately? The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to open it. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door swung open, revealing nothing but the empty hallway beyond. There was no one there, no sign of anyone having been there at all. The hallway was dark and silent, the shadows stretching out into the distance. I stepped back into the room, my mind spinning. The diary lay on the floor where I had dropped it, the pages fanned out as if in silent accusation. I knew then that I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I had to leave, had to get out before whatever force was at work here claimed me as its next victim. I grabbed my things, stuffing them haphazardly into my bag. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely manage to zip it closed. I needed to get out of this room, out of this motel, and as far away as possible. But as I reached for the door, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavy and thick. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out toward me with grasping fingers. The phone rang again, the sound sharp and piercing in the silence. I ignored it, yanking the door open and stepping into the hallway. The air out here was just as oppressive, the dim light flickering overhead. I made my way to the lift, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The ride down to the lobby felt agonizingly slow, the lift creaking and groaning with every floor it passed. I watched the numbers tick down, my heart racing with each one. When the doors finally opened, I nearly ran into the lobby. It was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. The night clerk was gone, the front desk abandoned. I hurried outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the empty street beyond. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I got into my car and drove away, the tires screeching on the pavement as I sped down the road. I drove for what felt like hours, the motel receding into the distance behind me. Only when I was miles away did I finally pull over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The motel was behind me now, but the memory of that room, of the diary, of the strange occurrences that had plagued me throughout the night, would stay with me forever. The next morning, I stopped at a diner in a nearby town, hoping to gather my thoughts and maybe find some answers. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard a conversation between two elderly men at the counter. They were talking about the Darkwood Motel. "You hear they're finally tearing it down?" one of them said, his voice raspy with age. "About time, too. That place has been a blight on this town for years." "Yeah," the other man replied. "Too many strange things happen there. People vanishing, stories of ghosts. Some folks even say there was a room that didn't exist. Room 824. I felt a chill run down my spine. I leaned forward, unable to stop myself from interrupting. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Did you say room 824? The men turned to look at me, their expressions wary. "Yes," the first man said slowly. "Why?" I stayed there last night," I stammered. The men exchanged glances, their faces pale. "You must be mistaken, son," the second man said. "That room's been closed off for years. They sealed it up after what happened." "What happened?" I asked, my heart pounding. The first man sighed, shaking his head. "It's just a story, but they say a man stayed there once, years ago. He vanished without a trace, but not before leaving behind a diary. People who read it say it's cursed, that it drives you mad." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The diary, the phone calls, the figure in the TV, it had all been real. But the room itself, was it real? Or had I been caught in some twisted, supernatural trap? I never found out for sure. But I knew one thing. I would never set foot in the Darkwood Motel again. Some places are best left forgotten, their secrets buried in the past where they belong. As I left the diner, the sun shining down on the road ahead, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the outline of the motel in the distance. But it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. And maybe, in a way, it hadn't. The house beyond the grove. I'm sitting here now, frantically scribbling this account because I can't shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong. I need to put it all down before it consumes me. I grew up in a quaint village in rural England, perched on a gentle hill. The street I called home was a narrow, winding path that barely allowed two cars to pass side by side. Often, one vehicle had to inch onto the grassy verge to let the other through. The street was a quiet, almost forgotten route that meandered through a few miles of forest, leading to the next village. Each house was separated by thick hedges or dense trees, giving the entire area a secluded, almost mystical aura. My house was near the top of the hill, a charming, three-bedroom detached cottage with a thatched roof. Most of the houses on the street were similar, modest in their appearance, except for the old, looming house at the edge of the forest. From a young age, I found the house at the forest's edge unsettling. It was clear from the outside that it had been abandoned for years. There was never a car parked in the overgrown driveway. The old wooden gate was so enshrouded by foliage that it seemed permanently stuck in place. The stench of rotting wood clung to the air as you passed by, making it thick and oppressive. The house itself was an ancient three-story farmhouse made of brick with wooden-framed windows and a tiled roof. However, much of the glass was missing, leaving dark, vacant voids that seemed to swallow the light, even during the day. A round cement plaque embedded in the front wall read 1783, but I never got close enough to inspect it properly. We seldom had any reason to go near that house. It was much quicker to take a different route, one that led to the church and onto a wider road. That way, we avoided the narrow forest path altogether, which could barely accommodate a single car, let alone two. The old house was a relic, an afterthought in our daily routines. However, I had a friend named Sophie who lived about half a mile into the forest. Because of the tranquility of the area, my mother allowed me to walk to her house on weekends and during school holidays. Each time I walked there, I had to pass by the old house. I never dared venture closer than the edge of the driveway, and I kept my fear of it to myself, convinced it was silly to be frightened by an old, decaying building. While walking past the house in the evening, especially as darkness began to fall, I would occasionally catch a glimpse of movement through one of the upstairs windows. It was always something fleeting, just the motion of something disappearing from view. I would never see what it was, and I rationalized it as a bird or small animal. Despite this, an unsettling feeling of being watched never left me. Even when I was sure there was nothing in the windows, the sensation of invisible eyes following me persisted. Winter was the worst. Returning home after dark meant navigating the mile-long stretch of forest path with only a small torch to light my way. The darkness seemed to swallow the feeble beam of my flashlight, and the eerie, subdued glow I thought I saw through the windows only heightened my anxiety. It was hard to rationalize away those fleeting glimpses of light. I tried my best to ignore the house and its creeping sense of dread. It never ventured outside, and neither did I, if I could avoid it. Over time, my apprehension waned, and I grew more accustomed to walking past the old house. My fears became less prominent until one day, something happened at Sophie's house that reignited them. I was around 12 years old. Sophie's garden was expansive, a beautiful rectangular clearing in the woods that looked magical at sunset, bathed in golden light. We often joked that it resembled a scene from a movie. Sophie's garden was far superior to mine. She had a treehouse, a slide, and a swing, while all I had was a patch of grass and an old toboggan. One evening, as we huddled in her treehouse, Sophie excitedly told me she had discovered a pond with tadpoles while exploring the surrounding forest. She asked if I wanted to see it. Enthusiastic about frogs and their transformation from tadpoles, I agreed. We climbed down from the treehouse and exited through a loose panel in the garden fence. With a metallic clatter, the panel fell back into place, and we were swallowed by the forest. We had ventured into the forest a few times before, but always during daylight. Now, as dusk settled, the forest seemed darker and more foreboding. I struggled to keep up with Sophie as we navigated through the dense woods, tripping over the twisted tree roots beneath our feet. Despite my efforts, Sophie seemed to slip further away with each step. As we darted past tree after tree, I suddenly found myself alone. Sophie, who had been just in front of me, was nowhere to be seen or heard. Panic began to set in, and my voice trembled as I called out for her, but only the wind's mournful whispers responded. The realization that I was lost hit me hard, and tears welled up in my eyes. I leaned against a nearby tree, taking deep breaths to calm myself. Determined to find my way back, I started walking in the direction I hoped we were headed. I continued calling for Sophie, but my voice was swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The forest around me seemed to close in, with towering trees and thick branches creating a claustrophobic canopy. The eerie whistling of the wind added to the unsettling atmosphere. I had forgotten my torch, and with each passing moment, visibility grew worse. After what felt like an eternity of wandering, I spotted a faint, unsettling glow through the trees. Hoping it might be a sign of civilization or a road, I pushed forward. My heart raced with a mix of hope and fear. To my horror, I stumbled into the overgrown garden of the old house at the edge of the forest. The house, which had always been a distant, eerie presence, was now close, its details more pronounced and terrifying. I couldn't comprehend how I had ended up here. Sophie and I had been heading away from my village, and I didn't remember any detours. The house's usual dim red glow was now vivid and pulsating, casting eerie shadows that danced across the garden. The light seemed to beckon me, creating a hypnotic effect. The silhouettes moving inside the house were mesmerizing, and I felt an inexplicable urge to get closer. The sense of dread that had accompanied me for so long melted away, replaced by an overwhelming compulsion to approach the house. I walked slowly across the garden, feeling the brambles and thorns tearing at my jeans. As I drew nearer, one of the dark figures in the window turned and smiled at me. The smile was disturbingly bright, a stark contrast to the darkness of the surroundings. The sight of that grotesque, grinning face shattered my trance. My instincts kicked in, and I sprinted away from the house with a surge of adrenaline. The ground seemed to tremble beneath me, a deep, resonant vibration that felt like a freight train roaring through the earth. I ran blindly, my heart pounding as I pushed through the underbrush, desperate to escape. I tripped on a low tree stump and crashed to the ground, dazed and disoriented. When I came to, Sophie was standing over me, her face etched with concern and fear. She told me that I had been following her when I suddenly started making strange noises and ran off into the woods. She had chased after me until I collapsed. My memory of the event was fragmented and confusing, clouded by the impact to my head. Sophie's account was disorienting, but I had no choice but to accept it as the truth. We returned to her house, where her mother quickly called my parents. My mother arrived to take me to the hospital. Fortunately, I was diagnosed with only a mild concussion. I fabricated a story about playing tag and falling, omitting the details of the house, the glow, and the unsettling figures. Sophie, though concerned, never mentioned anything further about the incident. The old house remained a haunting presence in my mind, and it took me years to muster the courage to walk past it again. When I did, I found the glow and the shapes in the windows were gone, never to return. I continued to walk past the house regularly until I moved away at 18, nearly 6 years later, but the memory never left me. Now, at 20 years old, I'm starting my third year at university in Scotland. I had returned home for the first time since I left 2 years ago, and the peaceful countryside felt like a welcome escape from the city's hustle. I contacted Sophie, who had stayed behind to work with her parents and take an online course. She was excited to reconnect, and we planned to catch up in her garden as we used to. However, when I arrived at the edge of the forest, the old house was gone. In its place was a large oak tree, standing where the house had once been. The driveway was now a simple, overgrown path with a rusted metal sign reading, "Warning, tractors turning," attached to the gate. I was stunned. Had I imagined the house? Had my mind played tricks on me all these years? I struggled to focus on my conversation with Sophie, the bewildering sight consuming my thoughts. I had to know if I was losing my mind. I broached the subject with her, hoping to make sense of it. "Sophie, do you remember the old house at the edge of the forest? The one with the glowing windows?" She looked at me, puzzled. "No, I don't. All the houses around here have been occupied for as long as I can remember. I thought there weren't any abandoned ones." I felt a chill as I heard the same bewilderment from my mother when I asked her. Had it all been a figment of my imagination, or had something far more sinister erased the evidence of the house? The thought was deeply troubling. Returning to Scotland, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been deceived. My new home, a semi-detached house on the outskirts of Edinburgh, was adjacent to a field and forest. As I settled in, I kept my promise to investigate the truth about the old house. One night, after unpacking the final box, I glanced out of my window. The field next to my house was bathed in moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows. As I peered into the darkness, my heart dropped when I saw it, a grand old manor, eerily similar to the one from my childhood. It stood there at the edge of the forest, exactly as I remembered. I stood frozen, staring at the apparition. The manor was back, just as ominously present as before. I didn't know what to think or how to interpret this. I felt a sense of déjà vu, as if the past had come back to haunt me. The house was both a comfort and a terror, and I realized that the answers to my questions might be locked within its decaying walls. I've decided to investigate further, despite the growing sense of dread. Whatever is lurking within those walls, I need to uncover the truth. Maybe it will put my fears to rest, or maybe it will deepen them. Either way, I can't ignore it any longer. I have to know if the house has always been there, or if I am the only one who can see it. As I prepare to face whatever lies beyond the manor's gates, I am filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I must confront my past and discover whether the manor holds the answers I seek. The Stalker. The clock on the wall ticked quietly as Harper sat at her desk, furiously typing away on the latest project. It had been a long day at the advertising agency, and the pressure to meet deadlines hung over everyone in the office. The office was a modern, sleek workspace, with glass walls separating the cubicles from the meeting rooms. It looked like the kind of place where creativity thrived, but the deadlines and high-stress environment left little room for relaxation. Harper worked in the creative team, designing digital marketing campaigns for major brands. Her colleagues, a tight-knit group of about 10 people, were scattered across the open-plan office. They were a friendly bunch. Matt, her best friend at work, was sitting a few cubicles down, scrolling through stock images for an upcoming campaign. Sarah and Danny, two designers, were deep in discussion over fonts. Their boss, Mr. Connors, sat in his glass-walled office overseeing everything, as meticulous as ever. Despite the warm camaraderie in the office, Harper had been feeling increasingly uncomfortable over the last few weeks. It started out as a gut feeling, an odd sense that someone was always watching her. At first, she brushed it off. After all, in an open office, it was normal to make eye contact with colleagues. But the feeling grew stronger and more persistent, making her uneasy in a place where she had once felt completely comfortable. She caught sight of Jake, a junior account manager, glancing her way from his desk across the room. Jake was new. He'd joined the company about 3 months ago, and though he seemed quiet and polite, Harper had noticed something off about him. Whenever she entered the office, his eyes seemed to linger on her a little too long. He didn't speak much to anyone, keeping mostly to himself, but there were times when she felt his gaze burning into her, even when her back was turned. One evening, as Harper prepared to leave the office, she felt that familiar prickle of unease. The office was nearly empty. Only a few late-night workers remained, and the hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound that filled the space. She gathered her things, her coat slung over her arm, and made her way to the elevator. As the doors slid open with a soft ding, she stepped inside. Just as the doors were about to close, a hand shot between them, forcing them to slide back open. Harper's heart skipped a beat, but it was Jake, standing there with that same blank expression. He offered her a tight-lipped smile as he entered the elevator. "Working late?" he asked, his voice soft but slightly too casual. "Yeah, last-minute revisions," Harper replied, her voice strained. She focused on the elevator's buttons, wishing the descent to the lobby would be faster. Jake stood a little too close to her, the confined space making his presence unavoidable. Harper's grip tightened on her bag as the doors finally slid open, and she stepped out into the lobby. She gave Jake a polite nod and walked briskly to the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. The feeling of his eyes on her back lingered long after she had left the building. Over the next few days, Harper couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It wasn't just in the office anymore. It extended into her personal life. At the coffee shop near her apartment, she thought she saw Jake standing outside, staring through the window as she ordered her usual cappuccino. When she turned to get a better look, he was gone. She convinced herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. After all, what would he be doing at her local cafe, miles away from the office? One morning, as she arrived at work, Harper noticed something odd at her desk. A small bouquet of flowers, a single white rose, tied with a red ribbon, was sitting neatly next to her keyboard. She frowned and looked around the office. No one seemed to be paying attention, going about their usual morning routines. "Hey, Matt," she called out to her colleague, who was just settling into his chair. "Did you see who left this here?" Matt raised an eyebrow as he walked over, inspecting the rose. "No, I just got here. Secret admirer, maybe?" Harper forced a laugh, but the pit in her stomach grew. She had no idea who could have left it, and the idea of someone sneaking into her personal space unsettled her. She glanced across the room, and her eyes landed on Jake. He was sitting at his desk, typing away, but for a split second, she thought she saw him glance up at her, his gaze cold and calculating. She quickly looked away. Throughout the day, Harper found herself distracted, like unable to focus on her work. The rose sat on her desk, a silent reminder of her growing fear. She wanted to ask around, but part of her didn't want to draw attention to herself. What if she was overreacting? What if it was just a harmless gesture? By lunchtime, she couldn't bear it any longer. She picked up the rose and walked to Mr. Connor's office. He was a fair but stern boss, always focused on the bottom line, but she knew she had to tell someone. "Harper, what's up?" he asked, looking up from his laptop as she stepped inside. She hesitated, feeling foolish for making a big deal out of a flower. "I found this on my desk this morning. Do you know if anyone's been in the office early?" Mr. Connors raised an eyebrow, glancing at the rose. "No, but I can ask around. Could be someone from the night crew left it by mistake. You know how it is with the cleaning staff." "Yeah, maybe," Harper muttered, though she didn't believe it for a second. She thanked Mr. Connors and left his office, her anxiety gnawing at her insides. A few days later, Harper was working late again. Most of the office had cleared out, and the darkness outside made the reflective glass walls act like mirrors. She felt a creeping unease as she worked, glancing up at her reflection more often than usual. That's when she saw it, a shadow in the reflection behind her, standing just a few feet away from her cubicle. Her heart lurched, and she spun around, expecting to see someone. But there was no one there. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and scanned the empty office. A chill ran down her spine as she realized she was alone, but she could have sworn she saw someone behind her in the glass. Her hands trembled as she quickly packed up her things. She wasn't staying a second longer. As she rushed to the elevator, she heard footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate. Harper's pulse raced, and she darted into the stairwell instead, not wanting to wait for the elevator to arrive. She practically flew down the stairs, her mind racing with fear. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air hitting her like a slap in the face. She looked around, half expecting to see Jake following her, but the street was empty. She hurried home, her heart still pounding, her thoughts a jumbled mess. She knew something was wrong, something far beyond the realm of coincidence. The next morning, Harper arrived at the office to find her computer on. She always shut it down at night, especially when working late. But now, her screen was illuminated, and a single open document was on display. It wasn't one of her files, though. It was a blank Word document, with just one word typed in the center of the page: soon. Her blood ran cold. She stood there, frozen, staring at the screen. The office was buzzing with morning activity, but she felt utterly alone. She quickly shut off the computer, her hands shaking as she did. This was no longer just a gut feeling. Someone was actively trying to scare her. That afternoon, Harper confided in Matt, her closest colleague. She told him about the rose, the shadow, and the message on her computer. Matt's face darkened with concern, and he promised to keep an eye out for anything unusual. They both suspected Jake, though they had no proof. Harper also went to Mr. Connors again, explaining the situation in more detail this time. He took her seriously, but without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much he could do besides remind everyone about security protocols. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. Harper constantly felt on edge, jumping at every little sound. She avoided working late, but even during the day, the oppressive sense of being watched never left her. Jake continued to act normal, though his eyes seemed to follow her every move, and that tight-lipped smile had become even more unnerving. Then came the final straw. It was a Friday night, and Harper had agreed to grab drinks with some of her colleagues to blow off steam. She needed to get out of the office, away from the suffocating atmosphere of paranoia. Matt, Sarah, Danny, and a few others were there, laughing and chatting at the bar. For the first time in days, Harper felt like she could breathe again. But as the night wore on, she excused herself to the restroom. On her way back, she passed by the coat rack and froze. Hanging there, amid the jackets and scarves, was her coat, but the pockets were turned inside out, and there was a single white rose sticking out of one. Harper's breath caught in her throat. She quickly scanned the bar, her eyes wide with fear. And then she saw him, Jake, sitting at the far end, watching her intently. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were filled with something dark and possessive. She backed away, her heart hammering in her chest, and ran to Matt. "Matt! He's here! Jake's here!" she whispered frantically, grabbing his arm. Matt turned, his expression hardening when he saw Jake across the bar. Without hesitation, Matt went straight to the bartender, explaining the situation. Within minutes, security was involved, and Jake was escorted out of the bar. The police were called, and an investigation was launched. It turned out that Jake had been stalking Harper for weeks, his behavior growing more obsessive over time. He had accessed her computer after hours, left the flowers, and even followed her home more than once. Jake was arrested, but the terror he had inflicted on Harper lingered long after he was gone. It would take time for her to feel safe again, both in and out of the office. But with the support of her friends and colleagues, she knew she would eventually reclaim her sense of peace. As she sat at her desk the following Monday, Harper glanced around the office, feeling a cautious sense of relief. The glass walls still reflected the faces of her coworkers, and though the shadows were long, they no longer held the same weight of fear. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe easy, knowing that the silent watcher had finally been caught. The elusive killer, Clara Riddell's case, is a haunting testament to the cold resolve that can be brought to even the most frigid and forgotten mysteries. A story woven with jealousy, rejection, and a long-burning grudge, the murder of Clara Riddell remained unsolved for over 2 decades. But her untimely death, and the brutal violence that marked her last moments, was never forgotten by her family, who never gave up their search for justice. In the heart of Westlake, a quiet suburb with tree-lined streets and a tight-knit community, Clara's story unraveled. Clara's husband, Tom Riddell, had always been the quintessential heartthrob. Those who knew him remembered him as handsome, charismatic, and athletic, with a sharp intellect to match. Tom was the sort of man who could charm his way through any room, and that made him the object of admiration for many women throughout his life. Tom was still a student at the University of Seattle when he met Stephanie Hale, a political science major with ambitions of her own. Their paths crossed during a tennis match, and what started as a friendship slowly turned into something more, at least in Stephanie's eyes. They had a connection, both being driven and highly athletic. Tom, who was easygoing by nature, thought little of their flirty exchanges, but to Stephanie, it seemed the beginning of something serious. She had fallen hard for Tom, believing that their relationship had the potential to be much more. Stephanie, in her mind, believed the two of them were soulmates, destined to be together. She saw every interaction with Tom as another sign that he cared for her as deeply as she cared for him. Tom's willingness to let her borrow his clothes or take pictures of him while he napped further solidified her belief. Though Tom saw their relationship as nothing more than a casual fling, Stephanie had already fallen deeply in love, and when Tom graduated and moved on to a job at a local tech company, she remained hopeful that their bond would evolve into something serious. In 1984, everything changed. That summer, Tom met the woman who would alter his life forever, Clara Lawson. Clara was the sort of woman who commanded attention, not just for her beauty, but for her ambition and poise. She had entered college at the age of 16, and after graduating, had become the director of nursing at Cedarbrook Medical Center, a prestigious position that required incredible talent and dedication. Clara was well respected in her field and widely admired by those around her. For Tom, meeting Clara was like a lightning strike. He was instantly smitten. Clara was everything he had ever wanted in a partner: intelligent, driven, compassionate, and beautiful. It didn't take long for the two to fall in love, and their relationship moved quickly. By November 1985, Tom and Clara were married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. They were excited to begin their new life together. But Stephanie Hale hadn't disappeared. Despite their casual relationship, she had never stopped hoping that Tom would realize she was the one for him. When she learned of his engagement, her heart shattered. As someone who had never been able to handle rejection well, Stephanie's pain quickly morphed into resentment. She couldn't bear the idea of Tom being with someone else, especially not someone as successful and accomplished as Clara. In Stephanie's mind, Clara had stolen Tom from her, and that thought festered into a deep and consuming hatred. By 1986, Stephanie had joined the local police force, rising quickly through the ranks thanks to her ambition and determination. But behind her badge was a woman still stewing in her own obsession. Tom had no idea just how deeply Stephanie's feelings ran. Nor did he know that his casual dismissal of her affections had planted the seeds of an increasingly dangerous fixation. On the morning of February 24th, 1986, Tom woke up like any other day. He had just started a new job with a local engineering firm, and he was eager to make a good impression. Clara, on the other hand, had mentioned feeling under the weather the night before. She was scheduled to teach a nursing class that morning, but Tom noticed she seemed hesitant about attending. He encouraged her to rest if she wasn't feeling up to it, and as he left their home at 7:20 a.m., Clara was still unsure about whether to go to work or stay home. By all accounts, that should have been a normal day, but it was anything but. Later that morning, after a few hours at work, Tom called their home to check on Clara. There was no answer, but he didn't think much of it. Perhaps she had decided to go to the class after all. He continued trying to reach her throughout the day, but his calls went unanswered. While it was unusual for Clara not to activate their answering machine, Tom figured she might have forgotten. It wasn't until he returned home later that evening that Tom knew something was wrong. As he pulled into their driveway, he immediately noticed shards of glass scattered across the garage floor. Clara's car was missing, and the garage door was partially open. His initial thought was that there had been a break-in, possibly a simple car theft. But as he stepped into the house, his heart sank. The front door was slightly ajar. Tom called out for Clara, but the silence that greeted him was oppressive. As he moved through their home, his steps faltered as he caught sight of her motionless body lying in the living room. Clara was still dressed in her nightgown, and her face, bruised, bloodied, and swollen, told a horrific story of violence. She had been beaten mercilessly, but it was the bullet wound in her chest that confirmed Tom's worst fears. As he collapsed by her side, trying to shake her awake, it was clear that Clara was gone. Her skin was cold to the touch, and the blood pooling beneath her was dry. The vibrant woman he had married just months before had been brutally murdered in their own home. The police arrived swiftly, and as they began their investigation, it became clear that this wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. There were signs of a struggle. Shelves had been knocked over, furniture displaced, but there was no indication that anything of value had been stolen. Whoever had attacked Clara had done so with a singular purpose: to kill. One particularly chilling detail stood out: a bite mark on Clara's left forearm, deep enough to leave a bruise. The police collected saliva samples from the bite, hoping it would lead them to the killer. Despite the overwhelming evidence that this was a personal attack, Detective Lyle Burns, the lead investigator on the case, seemed convinced that it was the work of burglars. He pointed to a string of recent break-ins in the neighborhood, where two unidentified men had been ransacking homes. But Tom wasn't convinced. He couldn't shake the feeling that this attack was targeted, that someone had wanted Clara dead. Nels Lawson, Clara's father, was similarly unconvinced. Nels had been devastated by his daughter's murder, but in his grief, he began to recall conversations he had had with Clara in the months leading up to her death. Clara had confided in him about a woman from Tom's past, a woman who seemed unwilling to let him go. That woman was Stephanie Hale. According to Clara, Stephanie had shown up at their home, unannounced, just weeks before their wedding, claiming she needed Tom's help with waxing a pair of water skis. Clara had found the encounter unsettling, especially since it seemed clear that Stephanie was using the skis as an excuse to see Tom. Despite Clara's protests, Tom had helped her with the skis, insisting that Stephanie was just an old friend and that their relationship had never been serious. But Stephanie's persistence didn't stop there. Clara had mentioned to Nels that Stephanie had continued reaching out to Tom, even inviting him to lunch after their wedding. She had even appeared at Clara's workplace once, though Clara had made it clear that she wasn't welcome. When Nels presented his suspicions to Detective Burns, they were brushed aside. Burns, convinced that the crime was the work of burglars, told Nels that he had watched too many cop shows and that his theory was far-fetched. After all, Stephanie was a police officer. Surely she couldn't be capable of such a heinous crime. Tom, too, dismissed the idea. He couldn't believe that Stephanie could have killed Clara, even though her obsessive behavior had clearly unnerved his wife. To him, their relationship had been nothing more than a brief fling, and he couldn't imagine that Stephanie had harbored any lingering feelings for him. But Nels couldn't shake his suspicion. The bite mark on Clara's arm in particular seemed to suggest that a woman had been involved in the attack. And as time went on, it became clear that the police weren't interested in pursuing any leads involving Stephanie. For 23 long years, Clara's murder remained unsolved. The case went cold, and it seemed that the truth might never come to light. But Nels never gave up hope. He continued to push for answers, believing that one day justice would be served. In 2001, the Seattle Police Department established a cold case unit, tasked with revisiting unsolved murders from the past. Clara's case was one of the many that came under review, and it wasn't long before criminologist Jennifer Francis noticed something unusual in the file. There was a DNA sample taken from the bite mark on Clara's arm, but it hadn't been properly processed. Francis decided to run the sample again, and what she discovered was startling. The DNA didn't belong to a man, it belonged to a woman. For years, Detective Burns had insisted that Clara's murder was the work of male burglars, but this new evidence pointed to a different story. It wasn't until March 2009 that the Seattle Police Department finally had a match. The DNA belonged to none other than Stephanie Hale. After nearly a quarter of a century, Clara's killer had been identified. Hale had been living in Virginia for years, far removed from Seattle and her past. But the long arm of the law finally caught up with her, and in 2009, Stephanie Hale was arrested and charged with Clara's murder. In her trial, it became clear that Hale's obsession with Tom had driven her to commit the heinous crime. The love she had once felt for him had curdled into jealousy and rage, and when she realized that she could never have him, she decided to take Clara's life instead. The case served as a chilling reminder of how unrequited love, left unchecked, can turn into something far more sinister. As Nels Lawson sat in the courtroom, listening to the final verdict, he felt a sense of closure that had eluded him for so many years. Justice had finally been served, and Clara's spirit could now rest in peace. But for Tom Riddell, the scars of that tragic day in 1986 would never fully heal. He had lost the love of his life in the most brutal and senseless way imaginable, and though his wife's killer had been brought to justice, the pain of her absence remained. The town of Westlake, too, was forever changed by the murder. Clara's death had shattered the sense of security that had once blanketed the community, and the knowledge that one of their own had committed such a horrifying crime was a wound that would take years to mend.